And I am going to introduce our speaker. Rabbi Pamela Wex. She was ordained by HUC, JIR, Jewish Institute of Religion, in the 90s. I don't think I have to give the number, you can, if you want, you can Google her. She served as a hospital chaplain, a congregational rabbi, and the assistant director of adult Jewish learning at the URJ, and as a spiritual care coordinator at a social agency in White Plains, New York. But she's here today to talk about poems. Pam's poems have received awards from Crosswinds Poetry Journal, Patterson Literary Review, Oberon Poetry Magazine, and the Robinson Jeffers Torhouse, and have been published in many journals. Her essays on Judaism, spirituality, and women's issues have also been published broadly. Pam facilitates spiritual poetry writing workshops and walks labyrinths in the northern Berkshires of Massachusetts. And we welcome you to Macomb Solel Lakeside, and we can't wait to hear from you, Rabbi Pam.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. And I don't know how many of you are already lovers of poetry, readers of poetry, writers of poetry, but if you are not, I want to find out at the end whether I have changed your mind. And I find that people are often intimidated by poetry, and part of my purpose here is to enlighten you about how to read it and how to understand it. One of my ways of thinking about it these days is that it's like painting with words. And that when we go to an art museum and we look at a painting, we don't always understand all of the symbolism, know what the intentions of the painter were, and that we should look at poems in the same way and take from it what we can without feeling that we get the whole bundle at once and the same time. What I want to start with, however, is teaching a bit about biblical poetry, and then moving to contemporary poetry. What you may not be familiar with is that if I saw you all at once, maybe I can go to gallery. Well, too many of you are off screen, so I wouldn't be able to see hands in any case. But if I were to...
You could have them right in the chat if you want to get a consensus.
Yeah, I would love to know, if I were to ask you what percentage of the Hebrew Bible is poetry, what your best guess would be.
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you say Bible, you're talking about Tanakh, which is...
I'm talking about the Tanakh, I'm talking about prophets, I'm talking about writings.
Right, so that's the whole, right, so it's not just the 5 books.
Moses, yes, I'm talking about the entire Hebrew Bible. What percentage is poetry? Your best guess. I see 60, I see 50, I see 15. Anybody else want to throw in a number? 30, 25, 25. Well, in fact, it's between 50 and 60%. More than half of the Hebrew Bible is poetry. And so when we talk about contemporary poetry and Jewish contemporary poetry, it's really grounded in the biblical tradition. But it has different conventions than biblical poetry. So when we think about contemporary poetry, we think a lot about assonance and alliteration, how it sounds, like repetition of sounds and repetition of vowels. And we think of rhyme, but that's not really the conventions of biblical poetry. It does use repetition. It uses what we call chiasmus. Chiasmus is when you say, like, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That's a chiasmus in English. And Hebrew poetry uses that. Hebrew poetry uses parallelism, and it uses other rhetorical schemes. So in the book of Genesis, there, I'm going to put it on the screen. You have parallelism, which happens very frequently. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. So you get this header that he's talking to his wives. Then you get their names, and he repeats, hear my voice. And then he repeats again, O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. That's parallelism. That is very common. We are coming up this coming weekend to Shabbat Shirah. And Shabbat Shirah, the Sabbath of Song, can also be called the Sabbath of Poetry. In fact, I'll be scholar in residence at a congregation in Scarsdale, New York, because they're going to make it not musical Shabbat, but poetry Shabbat, because the word shir and shirah, poetry and song, are the same root and word in Hebrew. And of course, Psalms, which is a whole book of Hebrew poetry, was probably intended also to be sung. So there are deep connections between song and poetry. This is what the Song at the Sea looks like in the Bible. I'm going to try to make it full screen.
Not just in a Bible, but also when you roll out a Torah, this is exactly what you see. Sorry for the interrupting, but and when you roll out, sometimes we roll out the Torah at Simchat Torah. When you see that, you immediately know where you are.
Exactly. So this is how the calligraphers, the Sofrim, calligraph the Song at the Sea in the Bible. And it's quite unique for a couple of reasons. One, as Vanessa just pointed out, it doesn't happen anywhere else. So when you see it, you know where you are in the 5 books. The only other strange thing with columns in the Bible is another song that happens in Ha'azinu at the very end of the Torah scroll. But what's so interesting about this one is that it is, in effect, a visual midrash. And this will become important for us as we think about contemporary poetry as well. When I say it is visual midrash, what I'm saying is that it has form that meets the content. Imagine what is happening when the Israelites are crossing the sea. They have walls of water on either side, and they are walking in the middle. And that is what this particular piece of Torah indicates on the page, is a column of water on the right, a column of water on the left, and in the middle are the Israelites walking through. Does everybody see that? Now, I just recently read an article by a poet who is also an editor of a very well-known journal called Tupelo Quarterly. And she said about 95% of the submissions they get are left justified on the page. And she said, you know, you have a whole canvas of a blank page to write with. Why are you left justifying your poems? Be more creative with your page. And I immediately thought of this that we have in the Bible, of something that is creatively using the page to express what's going on in the poem itself. So what I want to move to now is a little bit about Psalms. You're probably most familiar with Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But that's one of 150 Psalms. My teacher, one of my teachers, Alicia Ostreicher, who is in love with Psalms, wrote an article called "If the Psalms Aren't Poetry, They Are Useless." And in that article, she told us that the Psalms underlie devotional poetry in English, And isn't all passionate praise, all passionate lamentation and longing derived in some way from the Psalms? So she actually makes a case that not only all devotional poetry that is addressed to God or longing for spiritual connection, but even all love poetry in the English language derives from the book of Psalms. Interestingly, she also has a whole series of what she calls anti-Psalms. These are her angry Psalms at God. And I have had this conversation with her that she should not call them anti-Psalms, because the Psalms themselves express a good deal of anger at God. And so they are not, you do not have to call them anti-Psalms for them to be in the Psalmic tradition and part and parcel, even contemporarily connected to the traditional book of Psalms. Not a Jew, a devout Christian, C.S. Lewis, was devoted to Psalms, and he said, what must be said is that the Psalms are poems, not doctrinal treatises, nor even sermons. Most emphatically, the Psalms must be read as poems, as lyrics with all the licenses and all the formalities, the hyperboles, the emotional rather than logical connections, which are proper to lyric poetry. And so that's what I want to move to as we move to contemporary poetry, is not thinking that a poem has to be logical, that it has to make sense, that it can be over the top in many ways. And I'm going to share the screen again with some of my favorite definitions for poetry as we move to contemporary poetry. Reading or writing poetry is spiritual practice. It can open us up to imagery, to associative thinking, to spiritual inquiry, and to clarity of mind. Like any spiritual practice, poetry can deepen us, making us wiser, maybe even more compassionate. Last year, there was an article in the New York Times by Tish Harrison Warren about why poetry is crucial right now. And she said, poems slow us down. Poetry is the art of paying attention. Poetry calls us back to notice and attend to the embodied world around us and to our internal lives. In this way, poetry is like prayer. And what I want to say to that is that poetry is meant to be read aloud. And a lot of people who say they don't get poetry, it's because they're not hearing the wordplay and the sounds, which you can only capture when you hear a poem read out loud. So I'm going to encourage you from here on in, when you see a poem on the page, to read it out loud and to slow down, because again, it's not meant to be always understood logically. It is a spiritual practice to sit with a poem and let it work through you in the same way you might work with a prayer. Former US poet laureate Dana Gioia said a poem doesn't communicate primarily through ideas. It expresses itself in sounds, images, rhythms, and emotions. We experience poems holistically. They speak to us simultaneously through our minds, our hearts, our imaginations, and our physical bodies. And Emily Dickinson, I didn't write this down, but she said something about, if I feel like my head is lifting off my shoulders, then I know it's a poem. And I wonder if any of you have had an experience like that with a poem that has so wowed you that you carry it with you. If you have a favorite poem that does that for you, I'd love for you to put it in the chat. I'm always collecting poems that people love. So I'd love to know what poems you love. And then hear from David Ebenbach. He's married to Rabbi Rachel Gartner. He himself is a wonderful poet. he was trying to figure out how to define a poem, and he came up with this quasi definition, which is that a poem is a piece of writing that rewards you for reading it as though it's a poem, which is a fascinating way to think about it. If you read it as if it's a poem, and it rewards you for reading it as a poem. And he says, do you see what I mean? A poem, a real poem, gives you significant things, a rich experience, pleasure, when you read it with the focus and alertness to words and sounds and punctuation and everything else that a poem demands. So I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions before we look at some contemporary poems. And E.E. Cummings, Kate Baer. I don't know Kate Baer's work. And of course, yes, Amanda Gorman's The Hill We Climb. Keep it coming, your favorite poems. Any questions about poetry before we look at some great Jewish poems? Okay. So I'm going to start with one by Stuart Kestenbaum, who is the poet laureate of the great state of Maine, that he calls Psalm. And it is, well, we'll talk about it. And Vanessa, people can unmute themselves if they, okay, that's what we're going to do after we look at this poem. Psalm. The only psalm I had memorized was the 23rd. And now I find myself searching for the order of the phrases, knowing it ends with surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Only I remember seeing a new translation from the original Hebrew, and forever wasn't forever, but a long time, which is different from forever. Although even a long time today would be good enough for me. Even a minute entering the house would be good enough for me. Even a hand on the door, or dropping today's newspaper on the stoop, or looking in the windows that are reflecting this morning's clouds in first light. So he's doing something very interesting. He is talking to us in a poem about translation and the complications of translation. The JPS translation of Psalm 23 that the Reform movement has taken over into its prayer books doesn't say forever. It says a very long time. It is the most unpoetic translation of Psalm 23 you could imagine. You can't do better than the King James original, the Lord is my shepherd. You just can't. It captures the poetry of the original Hebrew. So there's something humorous about him playing with translation to get to his point. And I want to know what you think his point actually is.
You can unmute and give your point. I will only give the other side of some of these translations, is that in their, I don't want to say rush, but in their way to ungender some of our translations, I think it's like Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not want, but they don't say Lord, they say sovereign. He leadeth me, they don't say he. And you can see, of course, when do you hear this is at funerals, and many people have memorized it. And many rabbis use the old translation or the King James. And so it's interesting to see how this phenomena has come about. And what I wanted to say is that, many of the people here, we memorize things. I don't think our kids memorize poems or anything.
Right, correct.
And Jeffrey said, a moment's experience can be wonderful.
Beautiful, Jeffrey and Joan. So here you have a mindfulness poem. That's really what I want to say, and that chat comment captures it. It's a mindfulness poem. He's ultimately not interested in forever. Ultimately, he's not even interested in a long time. What he uses those translations to get to is, I'm mortal. Right now, just a hand on the door is enough. Right now, even being able to stoop down and pick up my morning paper at the door is enough. Being here now in this moment is forever. So I often use this poem, not only when I teach Jewish poetry, but when I teach mindfulness poetry, because I think that is the point of what he is trying to say. But I want us to learn a little bit about poetry and its form as well while we go along here. And this is a contemporary poem. It's a contemporary poem because each line does not end with a period or a comma. It is called, when you go from the order of the phrases and it wraps to the next line, that's called enjambment. I'm going to put that in the chat. E-N, and it's a special poetry word, enjambment, that you find in contemporary poetry. Now I can't get rid of that. I don't know if you see it. I'm trying to move it. Oops. The other thing that he does, which I am not in his mind to know, did you notice that he didn't italicize or put into quotations the quotes from the Bible? He expects that we know it so well. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. He assumes we know it so well that he doesn't have to set it apart, that we will know that that's a quote. And when you look at a contemporary poem, ask yourself, why did the poet choose to do it this way? Why did the poet choose to end a line, create a line break where he or she did, use punctuation or not, etc.? Those are the kinds of questions we're going to look at. And notice that there are no stanzas. It's just one chunk of text. But usually you know a poem because it has stanzas. And usually you know a poem is a poem because it doesn't go from left margin to right margin. It is shorter than that. Although we do today have something called prose poems, which throws a wrench into everything because it looks like a block of text. So here's one of Alicia Ostreicher's, and what she calls an anti-psalm. I have to stop screen and start again. Dear God, it used to be I would fall to the floor and press my forehead to it in moments of despair. I would say, help me, help me. But listen, I am okay. Though I just now found myself pressing my forehead to the carpet of my stairs, about the waters in the flooded cities, poisoned by oil spill, chemicals, the dead, about the survivors forever traumatized. Dear God, I am alive, help them. So what do you notice about her choices in writing this poem/psalm? I would love for this to be interactive if you would unmute and share your thoughts.
I think the way you read the poem was really beautiful. And sometimes when Oh, Richard said where each line stops. And sometimes when I read a poem out loud, I wonder if I'm getting the right syntax. And this poem has movement because she's pressing her forehead, to the floor and then to the carpet.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Andy, go ahead. I'm going to unmute you, Andy. We
Thanks.
can hear you now. Go ahead.
Well, what I'm struck with is it goes from inner about herself to a much larger circle of the outer, and she's switched her perspective or emphasis or caring really about.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I think that is exquisite. Earlier, it's help me, but she ends with help them. And it's just a beautiful movement of self-centered, it's my despair, to how do I hold the pain of the world?
I think it goes from despair to also appreciation that they're alive.
Yes, I am alive. I am alive. Help them. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in, I can always, you'll get a handout. Vanessa, do you have a list of people who are going to be here? Because I can send you the handout to send to them, and I can always add more of her beautiful psalms.
That would be great. Yes. I can get a list and I can post it various and sundry places. But yes, send it to me.
Sure. Anybody want to add anything else about this one before we move on? This, I don't know how many of you are aspiring poets, but a really easy prompt, write your own Dear God poem. And how do you make it more poemy than prairie? Like what makes this a poem and not just a prayer? And I think it is the perspective of the I.
Jeffrey and Joan said it captures a political argument in a few words.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And that's what poetry does.
Very succinct.
Every word, right. Every word is meaningful.
Beautiful. Vanessa, I didn't know you knew so much about poetry. You could be co-leading this with me. Beautiful. I see another hand, Gary.
It's Marilyn.
Oh, that's
Yes,
Marlon.
it paints a visual as you read the words. And also, I believe there's a religious aspect to this because it's called Dear God. And obviously she's of a religion that she prays as she drops to the floor, bends her knees and puts her head down as a position that we know that some religions is how they pray. And it takes you to the ground rather than to the horizontal. So there's so many images here, and you could actually paint this you could paint the picture in your mind.
Beautiful. So I don't know why I'm assuming she's talking about Yom Kippur and prostration because she is a Jew and she attends synagogue. So she's not talking about Muslim prayer. So it's either a question of whether she is talking about Yom Kippur and prostration on the ground, or whether this really is expressing such profound grief. Because I have had moments of falling to the ground in grief, in despair, that are not my traditional moments of prayer. That is just an expression of the grief. So it's hard to know, but thank you for that, Marilyn. Anything else on this particular poem? Notice that the only punctuation is in this line where she is talking about the social ills, oil spill, comma, chemicals, comma, but not even after the dead, because then it is a line break. So it's did she need those commas? And, this is something I would ask her if I were to want her take on using punctuation in poems.
The other side of it, didn't know it was there.
Okay.
I think it's important that she uses the commas because it makes us pause after each tragedy or an oil spill, a chemical. I mean, it
Okay,
adds
so I'm going to be able to do something here on my screen, which is not what she did. But again, how do you use the page to do something interesting that it doesn't have to come with punctuation at all, but it comes with the spaces you use on the page? Poisoned by oil spill, no comma. Chemicals, no comma. But it's set apart that you read it with that
and
same
you
pause.
emphasize it.
And
Yeah.
then it actually heightens the power of that,
3 examples.
voices.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of choices poets make. She lumps them together on one line. I probably would have done what I just did to set it apart, because now I'm playing a lot more with how I place things on the page, as I said earlier. I'm coming to a poem that for me mirrors what that song at the sea did in terms of form and content meeting. It's one of my very favorite poems to teach. It's called Synagogue of Green Grass. Every summer Saturday, my father worshiped, walking. I'm sorry, I'm going to start over. Every summer Saturday, my father worshiped, walked the roaring mower with its choir of blades away and back. As my brothers and I each in turn grew strong enough to yank the recoil, we were inducted into the mysteries of prime and throttle, spilling gasoline, the sweet benzene smell mixing with newly manned sweat, while our father instructed us to walk in straight lines. What's wonderful? I hope you all think this is as wonderful as I do. And the question would be, why? What is he doing on the page?
Well, I think he's, it may be an allusion or a reference to synagogue, because I think on Saturday, you absolutely abstain from all of this. And this is what his father has chosen to worship. So it may represent assimilation, different forms of observing Shabbat, individual observance, a recognition of God, and also intergenerational, what he's passing down to his sons.
So beautiful. So it may be that it's assimilationist, and yet the son is making it religious.
Exactly.
The son, it is not that his father has assimilated. It is that this is synagogue.
Right. This
Right?
is where he chooses to spend his Shabbat. But what's so interesting, I love the last line. While our father instructed us to walk in straight lines, I just think there could be not literal straight lines, but figurative, like paths of life, do the good and just things
Absolutely.
to do.
Oh, absolutely. That's the metaphor, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. But notice how when you have a title, this is the real estate of the poem. So I
Yeah,
want to say something about how important a title is.
exactly.
Because he didn't, with that title, that there's something religious going on. And he layers, what words does he layer? He layers worshipped. He layers choir. He layers inducted into mysteries. He layers, even this could be sort of the idea of
Sweet, yeah,
incense.
sweet
You
smell.
know, what you smell, what's worship, you know, what you give up to God is incense. And then of course, what you said about walking in straight lines, which
Right.
is being instructed in doing the right thing. I see a couple hands. Pamela?
So it seems to me that maybe it's the younger generation making excuses or trying to, maybe the poet was more religious and he's kind of excusing his father, saying that was his father's way of worshiping.
Nice.
I love the title Synagogue of Green Grass, because the association of a synagogue versus green grass, you don't associate. So I immediately think of, quote, religiosity in the mood, but it's taken in green grass, not in a virtual synagogue.
Absolutely. So here's another prompt for you. If you were to write your own synagogue of blank blank, that is not your traditional worship space, what would it be? For some of you, it might be your kitchen or the oven. For some of you, it might be your garden. For some of you, it might be the music room or a concert hall. Synagogue of what for you? And then how do you write a poem that layers religious language, that you have a few choice words like worshiped or choir or mystery, that adds to the idea, once you read the poem, that something religious is going on for the writer?
In the chat, Jeffrey and Joan said, there can be beauty in the mundane and it can be traditional. That's beautiful.
Beautiful.
And Andy, go ahead.
Well, I mean, on the other side of this, I see a lot of hypocrisy in the worship there. I feel like the words contradict each other, and especially that he's choosing this work and some of these harsh actions and, trying to set an example. And then, he's not doing what I would judge to be holy. But he wants us to walk in straight lines. Like, he's not setting the example, the
You mean
blade.
by not being in shul? Is that what you mean?
I don't care about that. I feel like he's setting an example that really isn't what I would consider the straight lines. To me, are keeping to a morality that is very insistent, and there's the straight lines are good or positive, but the fact that he's doing it this way, I don't know, yanking and blade, and
That's what you do with the mower.
I understand that. But
Okay.
I feel that image is so contradictory to the underlying hope of walking in straight lines that is really the holy part.
I think that you don't have to be in a synagogue to be holy.
Oh, I agree completely.
And I think
Anywhere.
that this author is saying the way this individual observes Shabbat is maybe not in the synagogue, but emotionally and spiritually just mowing the lawn. And in his head, he could be in that sacred place. It doesn't have to be a synagogue for this man, but I actually believe that he is at peace and observing Shabbat in a very modern, contemporary way.
Making his own.
And that's how the son apparently understands it.
Exactly, because that's maybe way the son might
Yeah,
appreciate it. He isn't Shomer Shabbos, but that doesn't mean he doesn't revere Shabbat and what it means.
Great.
He
Thank
could
you.
be that
Yeah.
way.
Thank you,
Even
Roberta.
sweet benzene. Sweet
Yeah,
benzene,
sweet.
benzene is toxic.
But the
Still a lot of
adjective
contradictions
sweet,
as a message. I got all the other part. I understand about you don't have to be in the synagogue and you could just be outside.
Yeah.
I just feel the imagery doesn't resonate that way for me.
well, it's funny, it does.
So
for
that's
me.
what makes horse races with poems.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
do want to point out like sound in those lines that you just pointed out, Andy. Spilling gasoline, the sweet benzene smell mixing with newly manned sweat. You hear the S's, you hear the long E sound, sweet gasoline, sweet benzene. These are choices the
Right.
poet, or if it's a good poet, you have to assume if it's a good poet, they are noticing sound, and he is using sound very well. But where I started was about form, meaning, function, and meaning. I want us to notice that we are mowing the lawn in how he has. Thank you. I see Jeffrey's fingers going back and forth, back and forth. He is mowing the lawn. He could
Exactly, it's in
he
the
could have
action
done
of mowing the
quatrains.
lawn, straight back
He
and
could
forth.
the reason he did couplets
Yeah.
is a choice because he's a good poet. It would not have worked if he had done a straight poem with no stanzas or if he'd done 4 lines.
It's like he's mowing a lawn.
He is mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
We have 2 hands up, Marilyn and then Sue. Marilyn, go ahead.
Yes, I like the line, as my brothers and I each turn grew stronger, to be inducted into the mysteries and the smell. And the same is with any religion. A parent guides you, and as you grow, you become more involved. Hopefully, you want to pass it on to your children if you're fortunate enough that that happens. So you are setting an example. And every Shabbat, my grandfather took my brother and I to synagogue
Yep.
and walked there, and
Walked
it was
to
a
synagogue.
ritual.
Right.
And
Right.
it
Ritual.
stayed with me today as I'm online with you now. I study and I'm more steeped. As I grow older, I become stronger and more inducted into the mysteries of my religion. And so this speaks to me in that way.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Sue and then Roberta. I'm going to unmute you, Sue. Go ahead.
Okay, I think I'm just going to take one more because I want to move on. To other
Okay,
poems.
okay,
There's
great.
So many poems. So yeah.
Okay, real quickly, in therapy, we talk about process and content, and what we've been talking about is the content of the traditional, and I love the whole lawnmower content. Have we talked about the process, which is how the lines are the lines straight and narrow, or the process of the poem itself? In other words, are the lines straight and narrow? Because the lines to me do not look straight and narrow. Would it have been would it have been more instructive or whatever if the lines were, all lined up perfectly?
Ah, I see.
As
He indented the second line, you're saying.
Well, just the way his
Something about
sentences.
movement. I felt movement in the way that he
I'm
indented.
talking about, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm talking about structure. The
Mhm.
structure of the poem. That's what I'm talking about. Not the content, but the structure. The
Mhm.
structure meaning the content. That's what I mean.
They're two different.
So,
And I felt
But-
like structure met content in this poem.
okay. Okay. That's what
personally. But
know.
yeah, that's what I
Mhm.
love about it.
Mhm.
So
Okay,
I have so many poems I want to bring you. So I want to get to this next one. Oh, I want to get to so many. This is really impossible to choose. I'll pick a short one by Andrea Cohen called Fellow Traveler. She tends to write very short and succinct. Fellow Traveler. She went everywhere with an empty suitcase. You never know when you'll need to leave swiftly with nothing. To me, this is a poem that is, well, when do you think you would use this poem? I'm going to put it in the chat, actually. It's that short that you can look at it that way and I can see you all. Fellow traveler, she went everywhere with an empty suitcase. You never know when you'll need to leave swiftly with nothing. I use this poem on Passover.
Mhm.
I don't recall offhand if it's Moroccan or Yemeni tradition. You do bring an empty suitcase to your Seder table. I don't know if that exactly was her intent when she wrote this poem, that it was in line with that tradition. But to me, it is a very Jewish poem because we're always aware we might have to leave. We're people who've done so many exoduses.
Right. On this weekend of Holocaust, International Holocaust Day, that definitely resonates with me. I see Susan I unmuted you. Susan, go ahead.
Okay. I guess, Vanessa, you just said what I was thinking about this poem. That and especially today, in light of the rise in anti-Semitism, I think we all have this feeling that we have to be ready.
Yeah, yeah. But I also want to say that that's one level on which we might read this poem. And I think the other level is about our mortality.
Wait a minute, Roberta. I'm muting you. Go ahead, Roberta.
I think I like that the poem has so much brevity because you have an empty suitcase. You go with nothing and you leave with nothing. And the brevity and shortness, succinctness of the poem emphasizes the empty suitcase and the emptiness. It is all inside you.
Beautiful.
Pamela.
It kind of reminds me of what Tevye says in Fiddler on the Roof, how he's always wearing his hat.
Nice. So we're going to go to a humorous poem that I would call a midrash on creation story, by Paul Hostovsky.
Right. And when Rabbi Pam says midrash, we know that this isn't in the text anywhere. This is sometimes trying to explain the text.
And it's not even doing that. I'm actually calling it a riff on creation, but it's very possible when you see what he's writing that he's not steeped in Jewish tradition at all. He happens to call the poem The Story of the World. Praise the improvised, the imperfect, the jerry-rigged, the jerry-built. Praise Jerry, whoever he was, a landsman after my own inept, broken heart, which I keep trying to fix with a little duct tape and Elmer's glue. Praise Elmer. Praise the tacky, tottering, half-assed job, the unprofessional, the unreliable, the unstable and unsound. Praise all the safety pins and paper clips and staples holding the story of the world together. A story that doesn't hold up with its impossible plot and vast cast of rickety, flawed characters, every last one of them unbelievable. I take back what I said, that he's not steeped in the tradition, because I think what he's saying at the end are the biblical characters. But he could be talking about us who are holding up the world. this is a poem that is playing on praise poems. Praise poems often use another word I'm going to give you, which is anaphora, anaphora. Anaphora is a form that repeats words. So here is the word praise getting repeated. It is a playful poem. He is playing with language. He is playing with where he breaks words so that you have dash, and then you have dash in a number of places, breaking words up into their, composite forms. I see a hand. I think Pamela, again, you had a hand.
Well, what year was this poem written?
I do not know offhand.
Because the original, the word wasn't originally Jerry.
I do not know.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't even mean that he knows. Okay, so we know the word jerry-rigged, jerry-built. He's using it poetically.
Okay, because
and humorously.
The original words of wasn't jerry-rigged. It was a racial slang of that.
So some of us may know that. I did not. And I think in reading this poem, you can read too much into a poem, Pamela. And because it's not a poem about race, I wouldn't assume that he knew that. I think he is playing with language. So even Fellow Traveler, the last poem we looked at, last time I taught that poem, I was told that that is an inside term for communist, a fellow communist, fellow traveler. I have no sense that was on Andrea Cohn's mind. So there's a way in which we can read too much into a poem. And that then it might destroy our enjoyment of it. Like in this case, I wouldn't necessarily go there, truthfully.
Pam's giving us a thumbs up, and I see that Evie, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Evie.
Yeah, you just brought up a problem that I've always had with poetry, and I'm not a good reader. I like to write jingles and things that rhyme. I've always enjoyed that. But the problem not the issue for me is, when do you read too much into a poem? I have that problem with literature as well, as opposed to what we're enjoying or what maybe the author or poet is trying to say. And I find it a struggle to get the meaning of it, as opposed to just sitting back, which I enjoyed very much on this one, of reading, just reading it for enjoyment. And in several of the poems that you just showed us, I was kind of relating it to maybe not so much intention of writing a poem, but almost stream of conscious journaling, where you're writing from your heart and then maybe being able to create it into something poetic without too much effort.
I think each of the poems I bring are more than journal writings, that they are carefully crafted poems.
I didn't mean to belittle it by any means.
No, I hear what you're saying. I think, some of what you're asking would come with reading more poetry. And if I might even give a plug, if you like what I'm doing here today, I do more of it in my spiritual poetry classes. I bring poems, we look at them, we discuss them like this. I teach you about the form on the page. I give poetry prompts, and then I did give critiques about how you can improve your own writing, what I see and how you might want to tweak it. So
And this is a good,
go ahead.
This is a good place to put in a plug for Walking the Labyrinth. And I'm putting a link in there. I'm putting Rabbi Pam's email address. If you buy the book, you'll send them a book play, right? Assigned.
So you can buy the book through the publisher, or I can mail you one if you prefer to have it signed by me.
So
It's just
it-
leaving February. I'm leaving next week for Costa Rica. So you'd have to let me know immediately and I can get it in the mail before I
Right.
leave.
right.
So I'm sorry, Evie. I love how you spell your name. It's Eve with a Y. To some extent, reading a poem is like a Rorschach test. You know, when I talked about Fellow Traveler, there is the shot level, the simple level, in the same way we look at Torah. The simple level is, you know, we might have to leave at any time. But if you go deeper, there's a secret level. And that secret level might be about mortality and that we could leave this life at any time and we can't bring anything with us. So it doesn't mean that there's one right way or one wrong way, that there might be multiple ways. But yes, I think there's a way also to read too much, that we get stuck somewhere. I want to, you know, we're getting close to the hour. We're at the hour, actually. I want to read a couple more. We won't have time to discuss them, but I want to read one by Jessica Greenbaum, who is very interested in form. And this is a form poem that is called a pantoum, in which the second line and the fourth line of each stanza then becomes the first line and the third line of the second stanza. And the poem keeps moving like that and builds and builds and builds upon itself. It's a very powerful poem called The Yellow Star That Goes With Me. A brilliant poem. And then I want to end with a funny poem that I wrote. The Yellow Star That Goes With Me. Sometimes when I'm thirsty, I mean really dying of thirst, for 5 minutes, sometimes when I board a train, sometimes in December when I'm absolutely freezing, for 5 minutes, sometimes when I take a shower, sometimes in December when I'm absolutely freezing, sometimes when I reach from steam to towel when the bed has soft blue sheets, sometimes when I take a shower for 20 minutes, the white tiles dripping with water, sometimes when I reach from steam to towel when the bed has soft blue sheets, sometimes when I split an apple or when I'm hungry, painfully hungry. For 20 minutes, the white tiles dripping with water as the train passes Chambers Street. We're all crammed in like laundry. Sometimes when I split an apple or when I'm hungry, painfully hungry for half an hour, sometimes when I'm on a train as it passes Chambers Street. We're all crammed in like laundry. It's August. The only thing to breathe is everybody's stains for half an hour. Sometimes when I'm on a train or just stand along the empty platform, it's August. The only thing to breathe is everybody's stains. Sometimes when I board a train or just stand along the empty platform, sometimes when I'm thirsty, I mean really dying of thirst.
Really
That's an
beautiful.
honor of International Holocaust Day. It's an exquisite poem, choosing even Chambers Street, very carefully chosen. She could have used Wall Street, same train. She uses Chambers Street. And I imagine many of us have had that experience where it may not be our experience or our parents' or grandparents' experience, but we have that Holocaust memory at certain times, and she captures it just brilliantly. I'm going to end, and then we'll take some questions. I have other poems that we're not going to get to. This one I call Ode to Horseradish. I'm going to read it, not share it on the screen. I used to search for you in the produce aisle at Stop and Shop before Passover. You were lanky and gnarled, your rooty rump fresh from the soil, medieval, like a spiky vegetarian bludgeon ready for battle. You were more than a girl like me would need for show on the Seder plate and my obligatory bite of bitters. I buried you to grow invasive as a weed, then deracinate you before the holiday each year, unclenching your stubborn claws. I chop you, give chunks away to those who think you come naturally magenta, steeped in vinegar and beets from a jar. When they taste the real you, unvarnished, flatbread and flashbacks thrash in their packs as they pray for release from unsung servitudes, tears running down their cheeks. So I had a lot of fun writing that one. You'll notice the sounds. I hope you heard the sounds, which is why I didn't have you look at the page. Flatbread and flashbacks thrash in their packs as they pray for release from unsung servitudes. You hear the and the S's, and that's the kind of pleasure that you can get from reading a poem, and is the kind of pleasure I often get from writing poems. And I hope I imparted some of that pleasure to you. Taking questions, comments.
Well, I want to say thank you for sharing your morning with us. We all learned a lot about poetry, and I hope that we'll continue on this journey. I've listed everything in the chat. Of course, if you need something, you know where to get a hold of me. And any other last questions? It's really beautiful and just makes me appreciate when I see a poem, to do a poem. And, I am called upon many times to give a Devar Torah or start out things with a Devar Torah. And this really makes me think that, I could start with a poem. Marilyn.
Forgive me, I came on a little late, but are your classes in person or on Zoom? And
They're all on Zoom.
And is there?
I have some in person, but the ones that I offer for poetry are on Zoom.
And could we have that information, Vanessa?
So I can send that to Vanessa.
Thank
The
you.
next one starts in March.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much. What a great morning. Hope everyone is inspired to either read some poetry, write some poetry. And I look forward to seeing everyone this week and as we go on in Zoom land or in person. And for those in Illinois, just be careful on the roads. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.